The unsets are a group of joke sets, usually easily picked out by their silver borders. These sets are, generally, not tournament legal, for a wide variety of reasons. Usually, these sets were a playground for the designers to test out ideas that they're working on, or to dump ideas that they know they can't have in any other sets. However, sometimes they just throw everything at the wall because they know it doesn't really matter, giving us some truly broken cards. Today, we're going to go over some of the cards that would be incredibly powerful if they were legal. Starting us off at number 10, we have Rare Be Gone. This is a sorcery with the mana cost of 2, 1 black and 1 red. It has the effect where each player sacrifices all permanents they control that are rare or mythic rare, then reveals their hand and discards all cards that are rare or mythic rare. This card is problematic in the real game for several reasons. First off, it raises too many questions about how it actually would work. You see, cards can and have been printed at different rarities at multiple different points in time. Do we check the rarity of the physical card in someone's hand, the highest rarity it's ever been printed at, or the lowest rarity? That's not very clear, and any answer would come up into some issues when we get into the few corner cases. The other big issue is that, from a design perspective, it's just a really bad idea outside of Limited. In Constructed, you're going to be playing a lot of rares in your deck. There are lots of powerful common and uncommon cards, of course, but rares and mythics are usually the things people are building their decks around. Rare Be Gone is a total blowout, and you're not going to not play the best cards in the game because a single sorcery might blow you out, especially since the player who's playing it probably has to make their deck a lot worse to be able to play a Rare Be Gone, since they can't play many rare or mythic rare cards. The thing that makes the card kind of broken is that some of the most commonly played rares in the entire game are lands. And if you take a look at just about any mana base, especially those of decks in older formats, often run basically only rare lands. Rare lands provide so much mana fixing that it's pretty much impossible to justify playing a deck without them. So Rare Be Gone is, in a lot of situations, a one-sided Armageddon that also happens to rip most of your opponent's best cards out of their hand, leaving your opponent basically completely unable to perform any game actions for just 4 mana, which is incredibly powerful. And while it might be a bit slow for formats like Legacy and Modern, people would at the very least still try it, and would probably see a lot of play in Pioneer if it were legal there. Or at least it would if it were ruled to be more generous on what cards it takes out. Again, it's a little weird trying to figure out how the card would actually work. And at number 9, we have Lila, Hospitality Hostess. This is a 3/3 legendary elf employee with a mana cost of 2, 1 green and 1 white. It has the abilities where you can look at the top card of your library at any time. You can cast common spells from the top of your library, and all guests you control get +1/+1. This has a lot of the same issues as the last card did in terms of card design. Knowing whether a certain card would be counted as a common is a bit of a pickle, just as knowing exactly what counts as a rare is. As far as gameplay goes, Lila would be a great combo enabler, if you wanted to play that way. A lot of the best combo deck enablers in the past were, for some reason, printed as commons. The Pauper format consists entirely of common cards and has a good number of combo decks built around these cards. For example, Lotus Petal and Dark Ritual are both commons and are completely busted in terms of how much free mana they give you to help combo off. Powerful draw spells like Preordain and Brainstorm have been printed as common, which can let you refill your hand on your combo turn and give you even more value off of your Lila. There are tons of random cards that can combo off that are also common. Grape Shot is a very common combo enabler for Storm decks. Freed from the Reel can let you go infinite with any creature that can tap for at least 1 blue and 1 extra mana. Lots of the cards that you play in Affinity decks are common. A deck built specifically around swarming the board with tons of little artifacts. Basically, you get it, you can build a very powerful combo deck using mostly common cards. With that in mind, Lila becomes essentially the most powerful version of this kind of effect for combo decks. Cards like Future Sight ask for a steep 5 mana to get into play, which makes it a lot less practical for combo decks. Cards like Augur of Autumn will only let you cast creatures from the top of your library, and only under the right conditions, which makes it better in fair decks, but a lot worse for combos. That means that Lila would be the best, most versatile Future Sight effect for combo decks. This wouldn't quite break the game, but it would be very, very strong, and people would probably find something very silly you could do with it. And at number 8, we have Standard Procedure. This is an instant with no mana cost with the ability where you can pay 1 and reveal it from your hand to choose an instant or sorcery card currently legal in Standard. Then, Standard Procedure becomes a copy of that card until the end of the turn. The reason why this card couldn't be legal is pretty self-explanatory. Having to memorize what every possible card this could transform into would be an absurd thing to ask of players. Not to mention, that would probably lead to a lot of really bad judge calls where someone tries to turn it into something and you would have to call and check to see if it's actually legal in that standard format. Now, disregarding all the reasons this card could never actually be printed, if it were legal, it would be very good. depending on the metagame. It's the epitome of versatility over power. There are a ton of really strong removal spells and cantrips available in most standard formats that could easily allow Standard Procedure to be a slightly overcosted answer to whatever you need in a specific situation. The keyword, of course, being most. This is a very hard card to evaluate because what the card actually does changes so often. Even once you analyze all of the best things for it to turn into, you'd then have to evaluate if it's worth playing it over a more efficient card in each specific metagame. This is all to say that Standard Procedure is a potentially really impactful card. Some of the best shenanigans you can get up to with a card are the fact that it could technically turn into most X spells, since they have a much lower mana value everywhere else besides the stack. When you check the mana value of an X spell, X is considered 0. This means that while Procedure could be a removal spell early, later on in the game you could turn into something like a Crackle with Power to burn your opponent to death. Standard Procedure is a card that would almost certainly make a splash somewhere if it were printed, and if it didn't now, it would someday. And at number 7, we have Rules Lawyer. This is a 1/1 Cyborg Advisor artifact creature with a mana cost of 3 and 2 white. It has the ability where state-based actions don't apply to you or to other permanents you control. Now, this is a card that actually does technically work within the rules. However, removing state-based actions from the game is sort of the most disruptive thing you could possibly do without actually leading to unresolvable situations. We do technically have rulings for how everything here should work, it's just not practical in the slightest. On a more competitive level, Rules Lawyer certainly has a lot of benefits. For one, it basically stops you from being able to lose the game at all. You see, one of the things that judges love to say about Magic is that damage doesn't kill creatures. State-based actions kill creatures. Essentially what this means is creatures, and by extension players, don't actually die from having too much damage or having 0 life. They die when state-based actions are checked and see that they have too much damage on them. So, Rules Lawyer would not only let you keep all your creatures around after they took too much damage, it would also let creatures like Force of Savagery actually stick around. The better use would be keeping yourself alive, of course. There are lots of cards that either let you pay a ton of life or deal a ton of damage to you. Cards like Madcap Experiment could be used without any downsides, except for dying if your lawyer was removed, of course. One of the better uses would probably be combined with something like Ad Nauseam, which lets you reveal the top card of your library and put it into your hand, but you lose life equal to its mana value, and you can do this any number of times. With Lawyer, you could just do this over and over to draw your whole deck, and then find some way to combo off from there. Now, while there are tons of great uses for this card, costing 5 does hold it back. For everything this card does, there's actually a card that's a little cheaper that does that, but only that. Angel's Grace stops you from losing the game for a turn, and can be used in most of the same combos as Rules Lawyer. At least, the ones that require you to lose your life. While it only works for a turn, a lot of these combos let you win the game right there, so it's fine to only not lose the game for that turn. Still, the sheer versatility is worth noting, and it might be the new best Platinum Angel effect for decks that want to try to sit behind a card that stops them from ever losing for as long as possible. And at number 6, we have Gleemax. This is a legendary artifact with a mana cost of 1 million mana. It is the ability where you choose all targets for all spells and all abilities. Now, there's nothing that stops this card from being printed in a rule sense. The only issue is that printing a card with a mana cost of 1 million is, well, it's not exactly practical, let's put it that way. Of course, if you never cast the card, you just never have to care about the mana cost. In fact, there are specific reasons why a card this expensive has never been printed. The most expensive card in all of Magic is Draco, which costs 16 mana but costs 2 less for each basic land type amongst the lands you control. This is very important because 16, you may notice, is lower than 20. You see, there are cards like Calibrated Blast that care about the mana cost of your spells. Specifically, Blast allows you to reveal cards to the top of your library until you reveal a non-land card. When you do reveal a non-land card this way, you deal damage equal to its mana value to any target. Then you put all the revealed cards on the bottom of your library. It also has a flashback for 3 and 2 red, which means you can cast this again from your graveyard for its flashback cost, but then you exile it. Currently, Blast is the centerpiece of a kind of janky combo deck in Modern that tries to flip cards like Scion of Draco to dome your opponent for tons of damage. As of right now, this deck will usually kill your opponent on the first flip, since most decks in Modern deal around 4 damage themselves with fetch lands and shock lands anyway on the first couple of turns. This means that 16 is usually enough to kill your opponent, but once your opponent knows what you're up to, they can pretty easily play around this. Having a card that does 20, or in this case, 1,000,000 damage with your Blast allows you to just kill your opponent with the card. There's a reason why Wizards has never printed a card this expensive in real life, and by that I mean just a card that costs around 20 mana. Draco will probably stay the most expensive card in the game forever, specifically because of cards like Blast existing. And at number 5, we have Urza's Funhouse. This is an Urza's land with the abilities where you can tap it for 1 colorless mana. But if you control an Urza's Tower, an Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Mine, you can tap it to add infinite mana. You can also pay 7 and tap it to head over to askurza.com, click on Urza's Funhouse, which will give you a random beneficial effect. For example, creating a 3/3 Black Beast creature token with Death Touch, or until your next turn, whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks, it gets -1/-0 until the end of turn. So, there are a couple of big issues here. You may assume that adding infinite mana is the biggest no-no on the card, but actually the final ability is the biggest problem. In tournaments, you're not supposed to access the internet, for what should probably be obvious reasons. So a card that requires you to go to a website for an explanation of what the card should do is, well, it wouldn't really work. You have to come up with an analog way of selecting the modes, which probably wouldn't work out. However, the card would be pretty good if it were legal. Urzatron is already a pretty good deck in Modern, though it's fallen out of favor as time goes on. Funhouse would be a huge boost of power to the deck. Being able to make as much mana as you want would let you play out whatever cards are still in your hand on turn 4, which is really good, though not strictly necessary. The ability to spin the wheel for various effects in the late game after you've emptied your hand gives you a lot of extra late game value. Now, the card wouldn't be run at too many copies if it were legal, mostly because Tron decks have a few land tutors to find the lands they need whenever they need them, specifically with Expedition Map. Making this even better is Urza's Saga, which can tutor out Map on its final chapter, making the deck extremely versatile. Funhouse is maybe a bit of a win more card, but with all the support the deck has, they could probably get away with running it just to give them a stronger late game. And at number 4, we have Staying Power. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 2 and 1 white. It has the ability where, until end of turn, and this turn effects don't end. Now, the reason this card can't be printed is a bit complex, and it requires a bit of back-end rules explanation. Suffice to say, the card just doesn't work with the rules as they're written right now, and would take a bit of work to fit into the rules. However, if it did work, it would be kinda busted. Now, making all of your giant growths permanent is pretty strong, but that's not really what you'd want to use it with. Cards like Angel's Grace, which we mentioned earlier, will just stop you from ever being able to lose the game while your staying power is on the field. Silence will stop your opponent from being able to cast spells at all, which will make outing your Angel's Grace lock almost impossible. One of the only ways would be Boseiju Who Endures. But if you know that's the only thing that can stop you from winning, it's pretty easy to start packing some stifle effects. Peace Talks will also shut down a lot of decks on its own and protects your staying power at the same time. This is, of course, just a few examples of what this card could do. There are just too many cards with very, very disruptive effects that are intended to only work for one turn. This effect is extremely problematic, and outside of not working, just isn't an effect that should exist in the game. And at number 3, we have Goblin Tutor. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 red and has the effect where you roll a 6-sided die. If you roll a 1, it has no effect. If you roll any other number, you search your library for a card with the indicated attributes, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Rolling a 2 lets you find another copy of Tutor. A 3 gives you an enchantment, a 4 gives you an artifact, 5 a creature, and 6 an instant or sorcery. Now, there's not actually anything on this card that makes it not work in the game rules. It's mostly just that this level of variance is frowned upon in competitive settings. However, with a bit of creative deck building, Goblin Tutor could be incredibly powerful. The best modes to hit would be, on average, a 5 or 6. Creatures, instants, and sorceries are probably the most common card types in the game. If you're building an average deck, you probably don't need to change how you build it at all for Tutor to be worth it. Finding your best creature or whatever instant or sorcery you want at the time for just 1 mana is very good. The thing that takes some more creativity is making it so that tutoring an artifact or an enchantment is also useful. Generally, the decks that want to find artifacts or enchantments aren't as interested in finding cards of the other types. However, this doesn't mean that a third of the time your tutor will just whiff. There are tons of powerful cards these modes can find. Urza's Saga is also technically an enchantment, and even more importantly, also tutors up artifacts. So, by making a toolbox of 0 and 1 mana artifacts, you can consolidate both of these modes in one mode. Urza's Saga toolboxes are already a thing, finding cards like Shadowspear or Mox Opal depending on the deck and format. Exactly how you would build this would vary a lot depending on the deck, but decks like Hammer Time could easily build their deck so that Goblin Tutor was always useful. Goblin Tutor would be one of the few ways the deck has to find Sigarda's aid. One of the best combo pieces, though in a list as well tuned as Hammer Time is right now, you might want to skip out on Goblin Tutor. While a card that has a 1 out of 6 chance to whiff isn't necessarily the best, the card is so efficient that there will be times it'll be correct to run it despite these shortcomings. And at number 2, we have Necro-Impotence. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 black. It is the abilities where you skip your untap step, and at the beginning of your untap step, you may pay X life to untap X permanents. It also has the ability where you can pay half a life to exile the top card of your library face down, and then you put it into your hand at the end of your turn. For the curious, no, fractions of life or damage are not a real thing in the game. And that is what is preventing the card from being able to be printed. This is a riff off of Necro-Impotence, one of the strongest cards ever printed, easily in the top 25 and even the top 10 depending on who you're asking. Necro-Impotence is even better than Necro-Impotence is, which is kind of crazy. It lets you draw twice as many cards and doesn't make you skip your draw step. It does restrict your mana by skipping your untap step, but there are several reasons that this doesn't actually matter. First off, paying some life to untap your land isn't great, but it's mostly manageable, especially since in any deck playing the card, you'd be running a ton of cards like Dark Ritual to give you a ton of mana. You can honestly just never untap anything and rely on the absurd number of cards that will draw for you to make all of your plays. Necro-Impotence is already one of the best cards for filling your hand before a combo. Impotence doubling the draw is as silly as it sounds, and the new restriction is ultimately lighter than Necro-Impotence's skip your draw step restriction ever was. And all the way at number 1, we have Blacker Lotus. This is an artifact with a mana cost of 0 and the ability where you can tap it and sacrifice it to add 4 mana of any one color. But then you have to tear Blacker Lotus into 4 pieces. You then remove those pieces from the game. Strangely, this hasn't been errata to exile, but that kind of makes sense. After all, if the card is ripped up, you can't take it out of exile or do anything else with it anymore. So as far as logistical problems with this being a real card goes, none have more than Blacker Lotus. If you're playing in an event and you have Blacker Lotus in your deck, you're going to need to have probably around 30 extra copies of the card lying around to put in after you rip up your Blacker Lotuses. This is simply an absurd thing to ask of a player, and no one in their right mind would think that this was okay. Now, as far as how good this card would be, well, it's an upgraded Black Lotus. Black Lotus is a member of the Power 9, the 9 most powerful cards in Alpha, and is currently the most expensive Magic card. It's absolutely infamous not only for just being so good in the average deck that it's basically always worth playing, but it specifically makes combo decks so powerful that they're basically unbeatable. The card is either banned or restricted to 1 copy in every format you can play it in. Blacker Lotus is just that, but better. There's no conceivable reality where the card isn't way too good. While we're here, we should go over Jack in the Mox, another card riffing on the Power 9. As a riff on the Moxen, it's a 0 mana artifact that taps for mana. However, when you tap Jack in the Mox, you roll a 6-sided die. On a 2 through 6, you add a mana of one of the 5 colors. On a 1, however, you sacrifice Jack in the Mox and lose 5 life. Now, despite the fact that this card could quite literally blow up in your face, the effect of having a Mox is simply too good to pass up. People would absolutely be jamming this in every deck that could play it, and it would push any format it was in into being very combo heavy. All in all, these cards together probably just go to show how broken fast mana really is. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any future ideas for videos similar to this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.